We're going to start out by taking a look at the type of procedural terrain we haven't covered yet, which is the infinite terrain. And if we right-click on the procedural terrain, we have the ability to load in presets. So we'll right-click on the procedural terrain, and we can now see we have a list of infinite terrains that come with the application, and also the ability to load in regular procedural terrains. Let's start out by loading in. We'll start with the default, what's called default. Click OK. And we're going to have a couple of questions that need to be answered. And the first is view saying you are creating an infinite procedural terrain. Would you like to discard the existing ground plane? In other words, do we want to get rid of this infinite ground since the terrain itself is going to cover the entire scene? There's not going to be any gaps. So I'm going to click yes. If I was to click no, it would keep the ground plane in the scene. You could use it as a reference. Sometimes it's good to keep for the grid, and you could just hide it from the render, which I'll show you in a sec. Now the second question is whether or not we'd like to view the sea level. Basically, this is going to define the zero, or what would be the z-axis 0 and relation to the atmosphere. Basically where the ground level is, where the sea level is, and that's where the atmosphere is going to start, and take into account information like the aerial perspective and a lot of the advanced atmosphere effects. So I'll just click yes, and what it did was add a sea level object to the scene. What you'll also see is there is an X over the icon. What this is doing is hiding it from the render. What you can do, and once I clicked on that, even xStream, in this case I'm using xStream, of course also an infinite, any of the standalone versions, with the default settings it's going to let you know that you can hide an object from the render. This includes lights as well, turning them on and off. I'm going to click don't show this again, and click yes. So this way we can trigger whether or not we want the sea to render in the scene. Now in the aspect tab at the top, you can also hide it from the render by clicking on the little ghost icon. There are a couple of other options as well as part of the aspect tab, and we'll look at those in a few minutes, or a little later in the training rather. If we zoom out in our other viewports, what we're going to see is there will eventually be an end to the terrain. To make it truly infinite, where the current camera position isn't really needed. Basically what it'll do is generate a terrain that will stretch beyond a lot of the atmospheric effects and appear to be going towards the horizon. If we look at the scale, we have 129 kilometers, which is the absolute total size of the terrain, which is huge. It's more than we really need. I mean, it's just enough to cover to the end of the terrain. So a lot of geometry there. Now, if I select the main camera, and I'm going to zoom out so we can see the full terrain, and now move the camera, what's going to happen is the terrain is going to move with it. And as I showed in the last section, it is using the world coordinate system. So we're never going to lose that geometry that's currently in place where the camera's at. It's going to move the terrain with the camera, and there's an absolute link between those two when you're using an infinite terrain. So we can zoom out and see that that terrain stretches all the way out to the horizon. And the scale, as we can also see, is linked to the absolute distance. So the more I bring the camera out and pull it out, the scale of the terrain increases on the X and the Y, provided that Z is your up axis. If you go to File and Options, you can change under Units and Coordinates which axis you want up. So if you're used to the Y-axis being up, you can use the Y-axis. I'm going to keep it the defaults. And you can see that now that we're higher up, we've got 611 kilometers. So it does scale as needed. What you'll also see is the aerial perspective, and with the current internal unit, it is currently set to a value of 10, and bring it down to 1, which is going to change the look of the atmosphere a little more, and the overall density. But basically, these infinite terrains are going to always extend to the end of the scene, so you don't need to worry about losing any of the information. And there are... I'll go ahead and just reset my camera here. I'm going to change the position using the numerics tab. And of course, there's also an infinite amount of detail with the procedural terrain. Now, you will notice that the geometry and the way it updates can sometimes be a little finicky when you're moving around and going over vast distances. What you also might notice, because of the scaling changes with the procedural terrain, the camera may appear to jump, even though it really isn't moving around the way it might look in the view. If you're having any performance problems, if you go to File and Options, under Display Options, you'll want to reduce your instant draw. Also, turning off Show Decimated Mesh Previews can help increase performance. I have all of my settings turned up. I do not use an OpenGL polygon limit, and I have maintained instant draw frame rate off. I've always found to have much better performance by not using this option. By default, it's turned on. Every system's going to behave differently depending on your hardware configuration. For me, I've always kept this option off. I've always found it to be causing a lot of issues for refresh when it's on. I also keep off in the general preferences 2 checkboxes in the preview options: disable automatic material preview rendering and only render material previews in Active Editor. I keep these checked on because when you have a lot of windows open and a lot of different materials refreshing, that's using your CPU to render every single time you make a change. Another option I like to keep off is the interactive numeric field changes. If I'm tweaking with settings or modifying different things, I don't want it updating with every single tiny little movement of a slider or moving up and down through different numeric settings. This way, once I have a set amount, I can hit enter and then it'll refresh. So just a few performance options. We can see I am under the sea right now, so I'm going to hide that from the render. And if we wanted, we could also turn off the sunlight that way, and then we'll have a pretty much black scene. So I'm going to go back to the atmosphere editor, and I am going to turn up the aerial perspective to 10, where it was set. You'll find that the default does change. The recommended, or what is supposed to be the most realistic aerial perspective, is a value of 1, and it will scale depending on the internal unit that is used. But you will notice that sometimes a default scene with an internal unit of 0.1 can sometimes have an aerial perspective of 10, sometimes have an aerial perspective of 1. So really it's up to you to adjust it in that case. If you notice there's a little bit too much atmospheric density, then you might want to check that setting in the atmosphere editor. So let's just take a look at how this infinite terrain looks. I also want to note that the more of the horizon you're showing in the scene, the longer it is going to take to process and render. When you're facing straight down on the terrain, it will render much quicker than when you're viewing all of that geometry in the back, because that is a ridiculous amount of polygons. So I'm just going to adjust the camera here a little, find a more interesting spot. Keeping in mind too that this preview of the terrain is very low res. Let's go ahead and just take a look at a quick preview render and see how the scene currently looks. And even by looking at this half-rendered preview, you can see that there's a lot of detail, and the geometry that is shown really doesn't give you as much information is actually in the scene. You can also see that aerial perspective might be a little high. I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor, F4 on the keyboard, and just bring it down to, I don't know, type in a value of 5. And if you have the OpenGL sky turned on, it will refresh as you're moving through areas of the scene. Even when you get up above cloud layers, it will refresh and start to render everything out. If you find that it's not refreshing, there's an option to refresh the sky. And depending on the shader model you're using, there'll also be options to show fog and view, density from the atmosphere, and those options would be more available when you have the display options just a regular OpenGL, not using Shader 4. You do need to have not a really new card, but if you're using gaming cards, the GeForce 7 series would not include the Shader 4. A GeForce 8000 series Plus or into the new 200 series, those are compatible. For Quadro cards, most of the newer cards will work with that. You'll have to check the specifications, of course. View will let you know whether it works or not. For the most part, gaming cards do tend to work a little better with View. So if you're having any issues using Quadro cards, you might have to try a gaming card. There have been some huge improvements to the OpenGL in version 8, so it might not be an issue as much as it used to be. But for the most part, NVIDIA cards tend to work the best. NVIDIA gaming cards, by far, have outperformed everything else. ATI used to be a more favorable card in View back in version 5, but since version 6 and up, NVIDIA has been the card of choice for View. Okay, so let's go back to this terrain. We've taken a look at the scale and how that can change. If we go to edit the object, let's take a look at some of the additional features we have. In the lower right of the terrain editor are two buttons, a new button and a save button. The new button changes that seed function. So if we edit the function, we now have, in this case, a multiply going on. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And it looks like I have just a few display errors here because the geometry is set so low. But when you click New, it's going to generate a new fractal. Most of the time it'll modify if there is a seed. In this case it looks like it's just kind of multiplying. And that might be because some of the modifications I've made to this. What I'm going to show you how you can do is create your own infinite procedural terrain. I'm going to go ahead and delete the default. And we're going to add just a procedural terrain to the scene. And at the moment, can't really find it in the main camera view. So there are a couple of options. If we take a look at the viewports, one thing we could do is frame the scene. That's one option. Frame selected objects if there is an object selected. If nothing is selected, it's going to frame the entire scene. Now, because the camera is so far up in the air, we might need to grab it, take a look at the position, and I'm just going to reset those all down to 0. Lift it up a little, select that new terrain, and change its position down to 0. So sometimes you gotta just kind of reset that. If we take a look at the procedural terrain itself, what has happened is because the last object in the scene that I had selected was the sea object, it took the material from that object and carried it over to the procedural terrain. So we can see that there's a water surface on it. So let's go ahead and load in one of the landscapes. We'll just do grass variations. And now we've got a better material for a terrain. That will often happen where the terrain material will, or materials when you're creating objects. I'm going to go ahead and create a sphere. And we'll go ahead and see where that sphere is at. And it looks like it's using one of the positions I had earlier from having the camera out so far. So I'm going to reset its position. And it's probably because I need to scale it up so we can see it. And we're going to go ahead and frame the object. And not having the ground plane in the scene now does make it difficult to see what's going on because there's no grid anymore. So if you do need to add a ground plane, you can hide it from the render just to have a grid. You can do that up at the top, select ground. We're going to turn it off from the render, just called infinite plane now. So this way, we at least have a grid we can work with and kind of judge scale a little better. But as you can see, this sphere now has the same material as the terrain, because the terrain was selected. But if we select the procedural terrain, edit the object, now in the terrain editor, I'm going to go back and just click new again a couple of times, and what we're going to see is that seed, and it's also thrown that multiply on there. But when I click new, it's going to modify that seed, which is changing the origin of the fractal itself and just kind of moving around that procedural. The other option is save. So what you can do is save out a terrain. Any terrain you're working on, you can save it out and load it in another time. If you're working with a procedural terrain, it's a PRT file. So you can make any modifications to your terrains that you want, save them out, and then access them by right-clicking on the procedural terrain. And then depending on the folder you save it in, or whether or not you create your own folder, you can load them in at any time, and any materials that are applied will also be saved. And any terrain will work as a procedural, or infinite terrain, any procedural terrain. So now we're in the terrain editor, and at the upper left, we have a couple options: symmetrical, skin only, and infinite. Once we check infinite, it's going to give us an infinite terrain. Now, it's not really showing up in our preview because of that zone problem, whether or not, like I was saying, that's part of the pre-release or they'll have it dynamically update. I'm not really sure. So now we can see the zone we had before and then the new infinite zone, and at the moment I can't scroll out any farther. So that really limits the ability to draw a new zone on this. So what I'm going to do, but as you can see, hopefully this is fixed by the time the full release is out. You can just easily change a terrain over to an infinite, and it looks like it didn't even register that I had made that change. There we go. We'll click OK, and we'll see if that updates. Okay, so now we can see the infinite terrain, edit the object, and I'm going to try to open just that procedural and see if it does anything. And it looks like it's not updating our zone. That's okay. We'll load in one of the presets in a sec. I do want to mention one more thing, though, and that is the Fast Shadows option. What this will do is use a lower amount of geometry to calculate the shadows on the procedural terrain, giving you a really good representation of the shadows. Basically, it uses what would be the shadowing of more of a standard terrain, but of course higher resolution, and then kind of playing along with almost like a bump channel moving on top of it to render. Now when fast shadows is off, it uses all of the procedural to render, and it does take a very long time to render. So unless you're running into issues or you're going to create maybe a projected matte where you really, really want as much shadow detail as possible, you can keep that fast shadows on, because the render speed change is just huge. So we'll go back and we're going to take a look at those zones. I'm going to load in the procedural terrain, that infinite default that we had before. And I'm going to edit the object. And let's take a look at zones. Zones are new to View 8, giving you the ability to focus more on other areas of the scene. Because an infinite terrain is, in this case, very difficult to really see what's going on in one specific area, what we can do is click View Zones. Now we can see the entire terrain is highlighted in this red box, which is the defined zone. Now if we want to work with an area around the camera, we can zoom in and see where the camera is located. We can see that showing up right there. And let's draw a zone. What we can do is click Add, and then we can draw and highlight an area, and that'll update and give us a new zone. So this way we can focus on one specific area of the terrain to paint on it, or even just get a good sense of that specific area of the terrain. You can switch between the zones. You can add additional zones. You can delete them. Would not suggest deleting all of the zones. At the moment, that doesn't go well with the application. But now we can view the zone, so this way we can make changes if we want to, say, sculpt, switch the freeform mode, we can pull out, maybe make some overhangs. And then we go over to that zone, and there's a fading option. What the fading option does is blends the zone into the entire terrain zone. So right now I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And we're going to take a look at the current scene. And if we take a look, we can see that area that I had painted and pulled out. We can also expand the terrain in the procedural terrain and see the zones, giving us a kind of a coordinate system for the specific zone. Although these really cannot be individually edited, but they do show the different zones that do exist. I'm going to just do a preview render, and we're going to take a look at the terrain with this current zone. Now, if we take a look at this, even this preview render, you can see mainly the area I had pulled out isn't showing very well, and there are some render artifacts where it looks very polygonal, and hopefully this is fixed in the final release. This is just kind of part of the pre-release, something showing up. But because I only really modified the center of the zone, we're really not going to be able to see this fading effect. So let's take a look. We're going to go back into that zone, and I'm going to go around the edge and just pull it up. I'm going to switch to the freeform mode, which will conform to the normal rather than the sculpt mode, which just raises it based on the initial first click. Click OK. And we'll take a look at another preview render. And now I did go back really quick and just raise up the edges around the entire zone. What you're going to see is a separation between these two different terrains, because really what is happening is we have with a zone a separate terrain. So we can even see underneath where these raised areas are, the other terrain and the entire terrain surface. So that's when we need to use that fading option. So if we edit the terrain, and I'm also using the show scene option, which will show the objects in the scene, also including ecosystems. We'll take a look at that a little later. It's a really good way to preview what's in the scene. We can see exactly where the camera is at, what it's viewing, also sunlight, and then you'll be able to see other objects in the scene as well. But what we can do now is turn on the fading option. And when we adjust the size, what it's going to do is clip inward. The larger this slider amount is turned up, and I do have to turn off the show scene in order to see this box, but we can see how it's kind of constraining and clipping in the zone. And then we have a fade type. Type 1, linear, sine, Gaussian, a couple of different options. We'll go ahead and use the Gaussian, just more of a blur. And this is going to control how the two terrains are going to blend together. So we'll just do another quick preview. And now we can see what has happened is we have a nice blend and a fade between the two different zones. So this way, when we get around the edges of a zone, we can easily blend the different terrains together. But it is normally a good idea to stay away from those edges. If you need to work in that area, it's better to have a larger zone, even if it means creating a new zone. Of course, in that case, you might lose some of that information that you've painted. And before we take a look at using infinite terrains for planetary scenes, spherical scenes, I want to make a quick note about the presets and the materials that are loaded with the infinite terrains. Most of the infinite terrains rely on that smooth area output, exported as a custom dependency to control the material distribution of the mixed material. In this case, it looks like it's using a projected texture map, which is not the original setup. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this terrain, load in a new one, and we'll go ahead and take a look at the material. And we can see that external dependency controlling the distribution. Now, I do want to note that a lot of these presets were not updated after a bug was fixed that was present within View 7. And that bug is whenever you send any information outside of the graph, in this case we have using a custom dependency and sending out a numeric output. In View 7, all of these numeric outputs were incorrect when received in other parts of the program. So in this case, editing the material and going to the distribution, the number output was wrong. So these presets may or may not reflect the changes made and the correction. You can blame that on me. That is a bug I had eon fix because it was causing a lot of issues. Unfortunately, the presets may not have taken that into account, and you might have to modify the scale of the detect rough areas in order to get the distribution to be what it shows in the preset. Because these were created when that bug was active, and in order to fix the bug or perform the correction, and in this case it would correct the preset if there's a problem with the distribution. And this will work either before the output or at the input. So we can either perform this calculation in the material, but the best thing to do would really do it before the output, because it's going to be received throughout the program, and this way you only have to do the calculation once. Keeping in mind that this is really only to correct the preset since the bug is now fixed, and what you want to do is multiply the number by 2 and subtract 1. The easiest way to do this is to add in a combiner node, set it to multiply. So selecting the link, selecting the combiner node, or you can right click and add a combiner, select the multiply, and then connect the nodes. What I'm going to add now is a constant node. Set it to constant number. Set the value to 2, so multiply by 2. And then I'm going to add another combiner, set it to divide. Set it to subtract. Which looks like it's spelt wrong. That's alright. Set it to value of 1 and subtract 1. So now this should correct any of the presets if they were not updated, which is a possibility. And instead of seeing a really small pattern, we should now see a correct distribution based on the original preset that was created. So this calculation will fix any of the distribution problems. And we can see that rendering looks a little better than it did before, where we can now actually see the distribution. And if you do own Snowflake through asileFX version 2, the correction is included, and even though the bug has been fixed, it's still keeping it into the collection because it can still be useful. And what you can use is I'm going to go ahead, add the input node, and this is from the base installation of Snowflake, using ngakasr, so a numeric graph output correction, sender and receiver. So this works to send information and receive it, and this will automatically perform that calculation. The other solution was to use what would be NGOS, numeric graph output saver, which sends information as a vector, which preserves the information because vectors were not affected. So if you're using Snowflake, then you can use that output. But let's go ahead and take a look now at Planetary Scenes. To enable a planetary scene, and we now just have that default terrain. I'll load something else in. I'll work with something different. Let's switch over to Rocky Desert. And we still have our sea level object in the scene. Now, in order to enable this option, and there are actually two options. There's Spherical Scenes and Planetary Terrains. So by enabling Spherical Scenes, we'll go ahead and switch over to the 4 viewport mode. What we're going to see is a bit of curvature on the objects in the scene. The easiest way to really see this is what I'm going to do is just add a cloud layer and set it to 5 kilometers, just so we can see the preview. It might even need to set it a little higher. Let's go ahead and do 50 kilometers. And now we can see that bar of the atmosphere. So if we're looking in the front view, we can see how the atmosphere extends as a sphere, creating a spherical scene. Keep in mind, with this infinite terrain, as we move the camera, it is going to move with it. And as we lift the camera up, it will increase the scale. And that would be the spherical scene, which will generate the information we need to zoom out and have a planetary view for the most part. But really, I mean, the terrain doesn't extend in the full sphere. So the other option we have, if we go to File and Options, under Units and Coordinates where we were before, use Planetary Terrains. What this will do is wrap an infinite procedural terrain around that global setting. So go back to Options, we can see we can set the scene radius, which is going to be the size of the planet. And also the mapping center based on latitude and longitude. And now, really the best way to navigate and operate the camera when you're working with planetary scenes is to use the front view or the side view, rotate your camera to view the scene, and otherwise it can be difficult to navigate because of the way the camera system is controlled. So if you need a little more precise control, you can really just switch to the other views. Also, I want to note that if your preview is not showing up and you really can't see anything at all, you might have to just rely on the main camera preview, or you might need to set in your display options the far plane distance. So increasing that, we can now see the full planet. The atmosphere may not show up lined correctly, at least not in the release I'm using. So now we'll be able to render a planet, and all of our infinite terrains will create these spheres. And if we show the sea level, we can create oceans. And my suggestion would be when you're wanting to create an entire planet, depending on if you're going to be moving in closer to the scene, is either to reduce the scale and the scene radius, or you're really going to need to increase the scale of the procedural for the infinite terrain. Metascale, you might need to go a lot higher than the current settings, or you might need to blend a couple of different nodes together in order to get enough distribution to get a good looking ocean. And that will of course intersect with the terrain. And the atmosphere is also something that needs to be modified in order for it to look realistic, at least for cloud layers. I will note that the aerial perspective becomes disabled. Whenever you're using a planetary spherical scene, it is automatically set to the correct value based on the size and scene radius. If you need to, you can increase the sky's overall altitude and make additional changes to get it to match your needs. But if we take a look at the cloud, I'm just going to quickly cover this. What we have in the cloud layer is a large scale density. This allows us to use a planetary cloud density map. In other words, the best thing that's really going to work for this is a spherical map, black and white, to control the density and the height of cloud layers. So what we can do is click this little arrow to load in an image, and I'm bypassing that visual browser, so I'm just going to get the Windows chooser. And here is my cloud map, which is a spherical map I created. And it's now going to give us an overall subtraction of this cloud layer, controlling the height. And we've still got that 50 kilometers set, so I'll bring it to 1 kilometer. And instead of seeing small little clouds now everywhere, we're able to distribute the layer and the cloud layer based on that image. So you can get either satellite images, spherical images of clouds, or create your own. And that way you can use these different maps on different cloud layers and get a little bit of a better distribution. This cloud layer doesn't seem to be working great with this right now. I need to make a few modifications to get the scale look right, but mostly it's because of the lighting and the current setup I have. But that's a large part of Planetary Scenes. But I'm not going to go really in depth with it.